The dust of the town square clings to everything, a fine, gritty powder that tastes of desperation and summer heat. Men mill about, their faces grim or calculating, but it's the woman on the makeshift platform who draws every reluctant eye. She stands small and still, her dress the faded gray of a long widowhood, her hands clasped tight before her. This is not an auction of goods, not livestock or property in the usual sense. This is Charity Henderson, or what's left of her, being offered up by her late husband's kin. A good woman. The portly man beside her, her brother-in-law Jedediah, announces with no conviction, but Barren needs a roof, a Christian man to provide. What am I bid for her keep? A strong back, if naught else. His words are a dismissal, a branding. Elias Thorne, leaning against a sun-baked wall at the edge of the sparse crowd, feels a familiar ache in his own gut. He's known lean times, still knows them. His farm, inherited and unforgiving, barely keeps him from starvation. He has no business being here, less business considering the woman. Yet he watches. He sees the tremor in her clasped hands, the way she stares at a point beyond the jeering, curious faces, her own a mask of weary resignation. He's come to town for seed he can't afford, for a miracle he doesn't expect. The word Barren echoes in the silence that follows Jedediah's pronouncement. It's a curse in this land, a mark of uselessness for a woman. A few pitying murmurs, a snicker from the back. No one steps forward. Elias sees the slow flush creep up Charity's neck, the only sign of the shame he knows must be consuming her. He thinks of his empty cabin, the silence that presses in on him night after night, the fields that mock his solitary labor. He's impoverished, yes, but perhaps not as poor in spirit as these townsfolk, so quick to judge, so slow to compassion. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments, and if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. Jedediah clears his throat, ready to lower his non-existent price. $1? Someone give $1 for a willing worker? Elias pushes himself off the wall. The movement is small, but it draws attention. He's not a man who makes himself known. His clothes are patched, his frame lean from work and want. He meets Charity's gaze for a fleeting second and sees not emptiness, but a flicker of something. Surprise? Fear? He doesn't know. He only knows the sudden, inexplicable urge to end this humiliation. He raises a hand, just a fraction. His voice, rusty from disuse, is quiet but carries, "I'll take her." A stunned silence, then a ripple of disbelief. Jedediah's eyes widen, then narrow. "Thorne, you?" He almost laughs. "What in God's name can you offer?" Elias feels the heat on his own face but holds his ground. "A roof, food, such as it is, my name, if she'll have it to make it decent." He fumbles in his pocket, pulls out the $2 silver he'd been saving for that vital seed. It's almost all he has in the world. He steps forward, places one coin in Jedediah's surprised palm. $1 for her keep, and with those words, his life and Charity Henderson's were irrevocably changed. The journey to Elias Thorne's farm was made in near silence. The only sounds the creak of the borrowed wagon wheels and the occasional sigh of the wind through the sparse prairie grass. Elias had said little after the transaction, merely collected the worn carpetbag that seemed to be Charity's only possession and gestured for her to climb onto the wagon seat. She'd obeyed without a word, her face still pale, her eyes downcast. He knew the town was watching, tongues already wagging. Elias Thorne lost his senses, taking on another mouth to feed, and a barren one at that. He ignored them. He'd made his choice, impulsive as it was, and now he had to live with it. His farm, when they finally reached it after a bone-jarring hour, was hardly reassuring. The cabin was small, weathered to a silver gray, with a sagging porch and a chimney that leaned precariously. The fields around it were mostly fallow, stretches of cracked earth interspersed with stubborn weeds. A few scrawny chickens pecked listlessly in the dirt yard. It was a testament to hardship, a place where hope came to wither. Charity stepped down from the wagon, her gaze sweeping over the desolate scene. Elias saw her shoulders slump, just a fraction, and a pang of something akin to shame went through him. He hadn't lied. He'd offered a roof and food, such as it was. But seeing it through her eyes, it felt like less than nothing. "It ain't much," he said, his voice gruff, "but it's dry and safe." She finally looked at him then, her eyes, a surprising shade of hazel, holding a weary sort of acceptance. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Her voice was low, a little rough, as if she hadn't used it much lately. He grunted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Elias, just Elias." He gestured towards the cabin. Well, there's only the one room, mostly, a lean-to for storage. You can have the cot. I usually sleep by the hearth." Inside, the cabin was clean but stark. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a narrow cot in one corner, and his own bedroll near the cold ashes. A few shelves held meager supplies. Charity placed her bag by the cot, her movements economical, betraying a life accustomed to making do with little. Elias had lost his own wife, Martha, and their infant son to fever 5 years past. The silence in the cabin since then had been a heavy blanket, smothering him. He'd almost forgotten what it was like to have another presence in the house, another heartbeat in the quiet. He found himself watching Charity as she moved, her initial shock giving way to a quiet assessment of her surroundings. She was older than he'd first thought, perhaps closer to 30 than 20, with fine lines etched around her eyes and mouth. Lines of sorrow, he suspected, more than age. Her hands, though, were capable, her fingers long and surprisingly strong-looking despite their current stillness. The first few days were a study in awkwardness. They ate their meals of beans and cornmeal mush in silence. Elias worked his fields, or what little of them he could manage from sunup to sundown. Charity, after a day of hesitant observation, began to find small tasks. She swept the cabin floor until it was spotless, mended his threadbare shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, and coaxed the sad little fire in the hearth into a steadier flame. She asked for nothing, expected nothing. The town's judgment followed them even to the isolated farm. When Elias had to go for supplies, trading a few carefully hoarded eggs for flour, he felt the stares, heard the hushed whispers. Old Man Hemlock, the storekeeper, a man whose face seemed permanently puckered in disapproval, had looked him up and down. "Heard you took on Henderson's widow, Thorne. Charity case, is it? Or you finally getting lonely enough to take any port in a storm?" Elias had just stared back, his expression flat. "She needed a place. I had one." He paid for his flour and left, the storekeeper's snide chuckle following him out the door. That night, the silence in the cabin felt heavier, charged with the unspoken weight of the town's scorn. He glanced at Charity, who was stirring a pot of something over the fire. She hadn't asked about his trip to town, but he sensed she knew. He wondered what she thought, what she felt, hidden behind that quiet composure. The truth was he didn't know why he'd done it. Pity, yes. A flash of anger at Jedediah's callousness. But there was something else, too. A loneliness so profound it had become a part of his bones. Maybe he just wanted another human being to share the crushing weight of existence. A week into her reluctant stay, A small incident shifted the air between them. Elias was trying to fix a broken strap on his ancient plow, his fingers clumsy and his temper fraying. The leather was old and stiff, the buckle rusted. He swore under his breath, ready to throw the useless thing into the woodpile. Charity, who had been mending near the doorway, rose quietly and came to stand beside him. "May I?" she asked, her voice soft. He grunted, surprised, and handed her the strap. He watched as her fingers, nimble and surprisingly strong, worked the leather. She examined the break, then went to her carpet bag and rummaged inside, producing a small, sharp awl and a coil of waxed thread he hadn't known she possessed. Without a word, she set to work. Her stitches were small, even, and incredibly tight. In 10 minutes, the strap was mended, stronger than it had been before. She handed it back to him. "It should hold," she said, a faint flush on her cheeks, as if unsure of his reaction. Elias stared at the mended strap, then at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father was a cobbler for a time," she said simply. "I watched and learned." He nodded, a grudging respect dawning. "It's good work, better than I could do." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, perhaps a touch of pride. It was the first time he'd seen her look anything but resigned. He realized then that his impulsive act, his purchase, hadn't just brought him a burden, it had brought him someone with skills. Someone with a past that wasn't solely defined by her widowhood or her supposed barrenness. He'd bought her keep, but perhaps she was already starting to earn it in ways neither of them had anticipated. That night, when he offered her the larger portion of their meager stew, she met his eyes for a moment, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. The dynamic was shifting, however subtly. He had offered her sanctuary, and she, in her quiet way, was beginning to offer him something too, competence, and a shared, if unspoken, understanding of hardship. The days settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the relentless demands of the farm and the slow, cautious unfurling of their cohabitation. Elias found himself observing Charity, noticing the small things. The way she coaxed the struggling herb patch near the cabin door into a semblance of life, her touch gentle yet firm. He'd forgotten about those herbs. Martha had planted them years ago, and they'd nearly withered away from neglect. Under Charity's care, sprigs of thyme and sage began to unfurl, their scent a faint, welcome fragrance in the dusty air. She had an eye for detail he lacked. One afternoon he returned from a fruitless attempt to clear stones from a new patch of ground, his back aching, his spirit low. He found Charity examining the rickety chicken coop. "The latch is loose, Elias," she said, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact. "And there's a hole in the wire mesh. A fox or a weasel could get in." He'd known, abstractly, that the coop needed repairs, but it had been low on his long list of urgent failing tasks. Together, they found scraps of wood and wire. He was surprised by her practical suggestions, the way she held the plank steady while he hammered, her hands unafraid of splinters. They worked in comfortable, if mostly silent, tandem, and by dusk, the coop was secure. That night, when she gathered the eggs, 3, a bounty compared to the usual 1 or 2, she offered him a small, almost shy smile. "Perhaps they feel safer now," she murmured. He began to talk to her more, not in long conversations, but in brief exchanges about the farm. He found she listened intently, sometimes offering a quiet observation that showed a surprising understanding of the land. "The soil seems drier on the west slope," she might say, or, "That old well, does it ever hold more water after a heavy rain?" He learned that her late husband, Thomas, had also been a farmer, though on more forgiving land than this. She spoke of him rarely, and never with bitterness, only a quiet sorrow. She never mentioned the word Barren, and neither did he. It hung in the air between them sometimes, a shadow from her past, but increasingly it seemed less important than the daily realities of their shared struggle. The small successes were punctuated by stark reminders of their precarious existence. A sudden hailstorm flattened half of his meager corn crop, the one he'd been counting on to see them through the early winter. He'd stood staring at the ruined stalks, a cold despair settling in his chest. Charity had come to stand beside him, her presence a silent comfort. She didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she'd later salvaged what she could of the damaged corn, husking and drying the bruised kernels with a dogged determination that shamed his own momentary defeat. One evening, as a chill wind whistled around the corners of the cabin, a knock came at the door. Elias opened it to find Jedediah Henderson, Charity's former brother-in-law, flanked by another grim-faced man Elias didn't recognize. Jedediah's eyes, small and assessing, flickered past Elias to where Charity sat by the fire, her hands stilling in her lap. "Thorn," Jedediah said, his voice oozing a false cordiality. "Just checking on Charity, making sure she's settled." "She's fine," Elias said, his voice flat, his body blocking the doorway. "Good, good." Jedediah rocked back on his heels. "Heard you've been working her hard. Good for her, I suppose. Keep her mind off things." He paused, then added, "You know, Thorn, that small parcel of land that came with Thomas's ma, the one Charity lived on? Turns out there might be some question about its rightful ownership now she's moved on, especially with no heirs to consider." Elias felt a cold anger rise. This wasn't a friendly visit. It was a veiled threat, a reminder of Charity's vulnerability and his own tenuous claim to protect her. "She's under my roof now, Henderson. That's all that matters." Jedediah's smile didn't reach his eyes. "For now, just thought you should know. Some folks think a barren widow ain't got much right to anything." He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture, and turned away, his companion following. Elias closed the door, the silence in the cabin suddenly charged. Charity was staring into the fire, her face pale. "He means to cause trouble," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He always resented Thomas leaving me that bit of land," he said. "He said a woman who couldn't give a man sons had no right to property." Elias looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. This wasn't just about a dollar deal anymore, or a roof over a stranger's head. This was about her, Charity, a woman who had brought a quiet strength and a surprising competence into his barren life. He thought of her mending his clothes, her hands in the soil, her courage in the face of his desolation. The thought of Jedediah Henderson, or anyone, troubling her further, filled him with a slow burn. "Let him try," Elias said, his voice rougher than he intended. "This is your home now, Charity, as much as it is mine." He saw a flicker of surprise, then a dawning gratitude in her eyes. She didn't speak, but she nodded, a small, affirmative gesture. In that moment, something shifted between them again. It wasn't just shared hardship anymore. It was the beginning of a shared defense, a silent alliance against a world that had judged them both too harshly. The threat from Jedediah, intended to divide or intimidate, had instead forged a new, stronger link in the fragile chain of their connection. Elias knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he wouldn't let Henderson or anyone else take her away or diminish her worth, not without a fight. The shadow of Jedediah Henderson's visit lingered. Charity grew quieter, more watchful, and Elias found himself scanning the horizon more often, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He knew Henderson was a man who nursed grudges and coveted what wasn't his. The casual cruelty of his remarks about Charity's barrenness, his insinuations about the land, were not idle threats. Elias began to think, truly think, about their situation. Charity was, in the eyes of the law and the community, his responsibility by virtue of that single dollar, but it was a flimsy protection. A word from Henderson, a complaint to the circuit judge about a destitute farmer unable to provide, and she could be declared a ward of the county, or worse, Henderson might find some legal pretext to claim her, or at least the land she represented to him. The thought was intolerable. He found himself confiding in her more, not just about the farm, but about his fears for their future. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, he spoke his mind. "Henderson won't let this rest, Charity. He sees you. He sees that land as his." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I know. Thomas always said Jedediah had a greedy streak. He tried to get Thomas to sign the land over to him before we were married, when Thomas was ailing." A shadow crossed her face. "He said it was no use leaving it to me, as I'd likely not remarry, being as I am." The casual cruelty of it made Elias's jaw tighten. "That land, is it valuable?" "Not much," she said. "Poor soil like yours, but it's free and clear. And it was Thomas's way of trying to provide for me, knowing I'd be alone." Her voice trembled slightly. Elias reached out, a clumsy, unpracticed gesture, and laid his hand over hers where it rested on the rough table. Her fingers were cold. She didn't pull away. "He won't get it," Elias said, his voice firm, "and he won't get you." She looked up at him then, her hazel eyes searching his. "But how, Elias? You heard what he said, what the town thinks, a barren woman." He took a deep breath. The idea had been forming in his mind for days, a desperate, practical solution that was also something more. "There's one way to make it binding, to give you protection. My name, Charity, properly, in marriage." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Charity stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and something else, a dawning, hesitant hope. Or was it fear? "Marry," she whispered. "You would marry me, knowing you're a good woman, Charity," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Knowing you're strong and kind, and you've brought something to this place, to me, that's been missing for a long time. The rest of it, what Henderson says, what the town whispers, it means nothing." He paused. "It would be a marriage of convenience, of course, for protection. So Henderson can't touch you, or what's yours." She searched his face, her own, a mixture of turmoil and a fragile wonder. "And you, Elias, what would you get from such an arrangement? Another mouth to feed, a wife the world calls barren." He met her gaze squarely. "I'd get a partner," he said, the word tasting surprisingly true on his tongue. "Someone to share the work, the silence. Someone whose hand I can hold when the wind blows cold." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Is that enough for you, Charity?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away. "Oh, Elias," she choked out. It's more than I ever dared to hope for." He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. It was relief, yes, but also a burgeoning affection that went far beyond mere practicality. He had offered her his name for protection, but in doing so, he realized he was offering a piece of his heart as well. The decision, once made, brought a strange sense of peace, but also a new urgency. They would need to see the preacher, make it official. Jedediah Henderson wouldn't wait forever. The very next morning, under a sky the color of gunmetal, Elias hitched up the old wagon. Charity sat beside him, her worn carpet bag at her feet, her hands clasped in her lap. She wore her best dress, the same faded gray, but she had mended a tear in the sleeve and brushed it carefully. There was a new light in her eyes, a tentative hope that made her look younger, softer. Their arrival in town caused the predictable stir. Whispers followed them as Elias led Charity towards the small clapboard church where Preacher Davies held his sporadic services. Preacher Davies, a thin, stooped man with kind eyes, listened to Elias's request with a thoughtful expression. He knew Elias, knew his hardships, his quiet integrity. He also knew Charity Henderson's story, or at least the town's version of it. "Marriage is a sacred vow, Elias," the preacher said gently, looking from Elias to Charity. "Are you both entering into this willingly, with full understanding?" Elias met Charity's gaze. She nodded, a small, firm movement. "Yes, preacher," she said, her voice clear. "I am, preacher," Elias affirmed. "I wish to make Charity Henderson my wife." As Preacher Davies prepared the necessary papers, the door of the church creaked open. Jedediah Henderson stood framed in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What in blazes is going on here, Thorne?" he demanded, his voice booming in the quiet sanctuary. "Davies, you can't be serious." Preacher Davies straightened, his mild demeanor firming. "Elias Thorne has asked for Charity Henderson's hand in marriage, Jedediah, and she has accepted. It is their right." "Right?" Jedediah sneered, stepping further into the church. "He bought her for $1, like a piece of damaged goods, and she's barren. What kind of marriage is that? It's a sham, to get his hands on her land." Charity flinched as if struck, but Elias stepped slightly in front of her, his hand finding hers. "This is between me and Charity, Henderson," Elias said, his voice low and steady, but with an undertone of steel. Jedediah had never heard from him before. "It has nothing to do with you." "Nothing to do with me?" Jedediah's face flushed an ugly red. "She's my brother's widow. I have a say in her welfare. And this impoverished dirt scratcher can't provide for her. He's trying to cheat me, that's what this is." "Elias has provided for me," Charity said, her voice surprisingly strong, stepping out from behind Elias to stand beside him. "He has given me a home and respect, things I did not have before." Her gaze met Jedediah's without flinching. "And as for the land, Thomas left it to me. Not to you, Jedediah. It is mine to do with as I see fit." The audacity of her defiance seemed to stun Jedediah into momentary silence. Then his eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this, both of you. The whole town knows what she is, what he is. This mockery won't stand." "It will stand before God, Jedediah," Preacher Davies interjected, his voice stern, "and before the law, once these papers are signed and witnessed. Now, I suggest you leave these good people to their vows, or I shall be forced to ask the sheriff to escort you out." The mention of the sheriff, a man Jedediah preferred to avoid, seemed to take some of the wind out of his sails. He shot Elias and Charity a look of pure venom. "This isn't over, Thorne. You mark my words." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the church, slamming the door behind him. In the ringing silence that followed, Elias looked at Charity. Her face was pale, but her chin was high, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and a fierce, newfound resolve. He squeezed her hand. "Are you all right?" She took a shaky breath and nodded. Yes, I am. She looked at Preacher Davies. Please, preacher, let us proceed. And so, with the wind rattling the window panes and the lingering echo of Jedediah's threats still in the air, Elias Thorne and Charity Henderson were joined in matrimony. The vows were simple, the words spoken with a quiet sincerity that resonated deeper than any grand pronouncements. When Elias slipped a crudely fashioned ring, a bent nail he'd smoothed and polished, onto her finger, he saw tears shining in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. They walked out of the church hand in hand, husband and wife. The town was still there, watching, but something had shifted. The open scorn was muted, replaced by a grudging curiosity, perhaps even a sliver of respect for their quiet defiance. Elias knew the fight wasn't over. Jedediah would not give up easily. But now they faced him together. He had bought a barren widow for $1, but in the hushed sanctity of that small church, under the shadow of threat and condemnation, he had found a wife, a partner, and a strength he hadn't known he possessed. And Charity, the woman deemed worthless, had found her voice, and a protector who saw beyond the labels the world had tried to brand her with. Their future was uncertain, the farm still a harsh mistress, but as they climbed into the wagon, a fragile hope, as tenacious as the prairie grass, began to take root in the barren soil of their lives. Life on the farm settled into a new, deeper rhythm after the wedding. The word husband and wife felt strange on Elias's tongue at first, and he saw a similar self-consciousness in Charity. But the shared vows, spoken under duress yet with undeniable sincerity, had forged a bond that transcended mere convenience. Jedediah Henderson made no immediate move, though Elias knew the man was biding his time, watching for any sign of weakness. The town, too, seemed to be holding its breath, observing this unlikely union. The small daily acts of partnership took on new meaning. When Elias came in from the fields, bone-weary and covered in dust, Charity would have a basin of warm water ready and a simple meal simmering over the fire. It wasn't just the provision of comfort, it was the care in the gesture that touched him. He, in turn, found himself looking for ways to ease her burdens. He repaired the leaking roof over the lean-to where she stored her precious herbs and supplies, built her a sturdy shelf for her few books and mending basket. These were small things, but they were offerings, acknowledgments of her place in his home, in his life. He discovered more of her hidden strengths. She had a knack for bartering. When they took their meager surplus of eggs and vegetables to town, she managed to trade them for more than he ever could, her quiet persistence and honest demeanor winning over even the skeptical storekeeper, Old Man Hemlock, who now offered her a grudging nod instead of his usual sneer. She seemed to understand the subtle language of need and value, stretching their scant resources further than he'd thought possible. One evening, looking over his sparse account book by the flickering lamplight, a wave of despair washed over Elias. The numbers were grim. Another bad harvest, and they'd be facing starvation come winter. He rubbed his temples, the weight of his responsibility, now doubled, pressing down on him. Charity, sensing his mood, came to sit beside him. "What is it, Elias?" He pushed the book towards her. "It's no good, Charity. The land, it just won't give enough. I don't know how we'll make it through." She studied the figures, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she looked up, her gaze surprisingly steady. "This west slope," she said, tapping a section of his crudely drawn farm map. "You said it's dry, but there's that gully at the bottom. After a heavy rain, does water collect there?" Elias thought back. "Some, for a day or two, maybe." "And the soil there?" "Rocky, but maybe not as bad as the rest." "What if," she said slowly, "we tried to build a small check dam, just stones and earth, to hold some of that runoff longer, and plant something hardier there? Beans perhaps, or squash. They don't need as much as corn." He stared at her. It was a simple idea, yet it had never occurred to him. He'd always farmed the way his father had, fighting the same patches of exhausted land. "It would be hard work," he said, doubt still heavy in his voice. "Moving those stones." "We can do it together," she said, a quiet confidence in her voice. "A little each day. What have we to lose, Elias?" And so began their new project. Day after day, they worked side by side, clearing stones from the gully, painstakingly building a low, sturdy dam. It was back-breaking labor. His muscles ached, his hands were raw. He saw the strain on Charity too, but she never complained, her determination a quiet rebuke to his own flagging spirits. Neighbors, on the rare occasions they passed by, would shake their heads at the sight of the Thorns toiling away on what seemed like a fool's errand. "Wasting their time," he heard one mutter. "That land's cursed." But as the small dam grew, so did something else. A shared sense of purpose, a camaraderie forged in sweat and effort. They spoke little as they worked, but their movements became synchronized, a silent dance of shared labor. Sometimes, he'd catch her looking at him, a small, encouraging smile on her lips, and he'd feel a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the sun. Then the rains came, not a hailstorm this time, but a steady, soaking rain that lasted for 2 days. Elias and Charity stood on the edge of the gully, watching as water trickled down the slope and began to pool behind their makeshift dam. It wasn't a lake, not even a pond, but it was water, precious water, held captive where before it would have simply run off and been lost. Charity gripped his arm, her eyes shining. "It's working, Elias, it's working." A slow grin spread across Elias's face. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. They had taken a piece of barren, forgotten land and, with their own hands, begun to coax life from it. In the weeks that followed, they planted beans and squash in the enriched, damp soil below the dam. Charity tended the new patch with meticulous care, her touch seeming to coax the seedlings from the earth. And, miraculously, they grew. The plants were hardy, resilient, thriving in a way nothing else on his farm ever had. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they were harvesting a small but significant crop of plump beans and heavy squash, Charity paused, her hands full. She looked out over the small, productive patch, then at Elias, her face glowing with a quiet triumph. "We did it, Elias," she said softly. He nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't just about the food, vital as it was. It was about the shared effort, the proof that together they could achieve what he alone had deemed impossible. He looked at Charity, truly looked at her, not as the barren widow he had bought, but as his partner, his wife, the woman who had shown him how to find hope in the most desolate of places. The legacy he had vaguely hoped for when he'd first contemplated taking a wife, a son to carry on his name, to work the land, seemed less important now. Or perhaps he was beginning to understand a legacy could take many forms. Charity had already given him so much: companionship, resilience, a renewed sense of purpose. She had helped him breathe life back into his failing farm and into his own withered spirit. It was a few weeks later, as the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the prairie, that Charity approached him, her face pale but her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and an almost unbearable joy. She took his calloused hand and placed it on her belly, just below her waist. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling, I think, I think I am with child." Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend her words. With child, Charity, the woman everyone, including herself, had believed to be barren. He felt her hand tremble under his, felt the slight, almost imperceptible roundness of her abdomen, a wave of disbelief, then a surge of overwhelming, incredulous joy washed over him. Tears welled in his eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. "Charity," he choked out. Are you sure?" She nodded against his chest, her own tears dampening his shirt. I didn't dare to hope, but all the signs. And then, this morning, he held her away from him, searching her face, seeing the wonder, the fear, the incredible shining hope that mirrored his own. He thought of Jedediah's cruel words, of the town's judgment, of Charity's own quiet sorrow, and he felt a fierce, protective love swell in his heart, so powerful it almost took his breath away. The impoverished farmer had bought a barren widow for $1, and she, Charity, his wife, his partner, the quiet miracle in his life, was about to give him the greatest legacy of all. Not just a child to carry on his name, but the living, breathing proof that love and hope could blossom in the most unlikely of places, defying all expectation, transforming barrenness into abundance. The land around them was still harsh, the future still uncertain, but as he held Charity close, her body warm and vital against his, Elias Thorne knew a richness he had never imagined. He had found his heart, his home, and his future, all in the unexpected gift of a woman the world had deemed worthless. Their small cabin, once a place of silence and despair, now held the promise of new life, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the surprising ways in which a legacy could be sown. The news of Charity's condition, when it eventually and inevitably trickled into town, was met with stunned disbelief, then a grudging, bewildered acceptance. Jedediah Henderson, it was said, had turned a peculiar shade of purple and had not been seen in public for several days. Some whispered it was a miracle, others, more cynically, muttered about late bloomers or mistaken diagnoses. But for Elias and Charity, it was simply the quiet, astonishing culmination of their shared journey. The winter was hard, as always, but the cabin felt warmer, brighter. The squash and beans from their reclaimed patch, carefully stored, supplemented their meager diet. Charity, despite her growing belly, continued to manage their small household with her usual quiet efficiency, her face softer now, imbued with a serene glow. Elias found himself watching her constantly, a sense of awe filling him. He worked with a renewed vigor, his steps lighter, his heart full. As spring approached, bringing with it the promise of renewal, Charity gave birth to a healthy baby boy, with a tuft of dark hair like Elias's and eyes the surprising hazel of his mother's. They named him Thomas, after Charity's first husband, a gesture of respect and remembrance that Charity made with tears in her eyes, and Samuel, after Elias's own lost son, a quiet hope for the future. The legacy was no longer an abstract concept. It was small and loud, and it filled their tiny cabin with a new kind of life. Elias would come in from the fields, and Charity would be there, humming softly as she rocked young Thomas Samuel Thorne, her face alight with a love that encompassed both her child and the man who had given her a second chance at everything. He looked at his son, at his wife, at the small farm that was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to yield to their combined efforts, and knew a profound contentment. He had gambled $1 on a woman deemed barren, and in return, she had given him a world. The land might still be poor, but he was the richest man he knew. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.